All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So what are we doing now? Well, as I said, we try to make sure that the topics that we give you in this course come just as you need them. And this one, the topic of ludology, is actually something that kind of spans multiple weeks throughout the course. So what we talked about it last week was just the general idea of what things are fun and what makes things fun and kind of how you think about it. Um, what we're going to do today is talk about it again now that you're at the stage where you've been submitting your game ideas and you probably want to be thinking about, okay, well, if this is an idea, how do I take this idea and flesh it out into something that's a little bit more appropriate for a pitch? Um, so the pitch, the difference between kind of the game idea, which is sort of like hey, why don't we make a game where you play the entire, it's like an endless runner where you play the entire thing backwards. So, and this is sort of the idea, right? Like this, like, ooh, this is kind of a neat concept, what the pitch is supposed to be is trying to say, okay, but so how would this look like as a game? Not as far as the design. The design document is when you have to actually like draw out some of the levels, sketch out the characters. Like you basically are putting together something that you're going to commit to that will kind of be embodying your final game. Now, the pitch is more like we've thought about this idea and we've kind of explored where this can go, and we've carved out this portion of it as being the thing we're going to do for our game. So that's basically what a pitch is meant to be. And we're going to talk about the pitch, I guess, on Thursday. But anyway, we're not doing that just yet, right? What we're trying to do, though, is trying to figure out, okay, now that we're at the stage where we have some of these ideas, how do we go and explore them a little bit more to make sure that they're fun? And you might say, well, if we have the idea, then isn't that kind of, aren't we already saying that this is fun, especially if, the instructors have chosen it and decided it is? What we're going to do is when we choose the 10 ideas that look like they have the most potential, we're going to respond with a few bits of feedback. And then you still have to kind of go back to this idea and figure out how to flesh it out some more. So today is, again, revisiting the idea of how to make an idea fun by having you be mindful of some of the things that producers think about when they're trying to kind of firm up their original concept. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. And just responding to the stuff in the chat, coming up with names for the game ideas. We've seen some game names where one of them was called like Ethan's Game because it was the guy named Ethan couldn't come up with a game name, so we just called it Ethan's Game, and it was called Ethan's Game for a while. So, that's fine. And yes, we will definitely give you opportunities to change the name of your game, especially as the theme of your game evolves. Then you start to realize like, oh, actually this game is no longer what it was in the beginning. Or suddenly someone in your group is like, hey, why don't we call it this? And I'm like, that's brilliant. We should totally change it. But, just come up with something where at least we can identify your game by it, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where we were, previously. So you've come up with an idea. Great. And for the current, like the deadline we have is for later this evening, like around 6 p.m. or so. We want everyone to submit about 2 to 3 ideas each. And they don't have to be amazing, right? They just have to be like, this is the exercise that we want you to do to think about what kind of things could be a good game and thinking about things like mechanics and, what a game could be about. Okay, so you've got the idea. And the first stage, of course, is to then take this idea and start making it. And of course, I wouldn't be asking that question if that was the answer, because there's always things that need to be considered before we go any further. Oh, by the way, these slides are up on Quirkus. So is the course information sheet, and we've updated it so that all the deadlines and stuff are now more fleshed out. So, yay. Anyway, when we talk about game ideas, we usually say the first idea that you come up with, while it might be good, generally we can't assume that the first idea is always the best one. This is a pitfall that a lot of people make when it comes to this course. They think of an idea and they start latching onto it, even if it's not great, right? They just keep staying with it and trying to figure out ways of making it better, when at its core they might have actually been better off coming up with something else. And in the past, we actually would have people, like before we had people submit game ideas like you're doing today, we would have people come to their pitch presentations, and that would be the first time that we would actually see their game ideas. And we would have people present 2, because if we had people present 1, if it was terrible, well, then we're stuck, right? We're stuck with a really terrible game, and that's what they're committed to. And now the next 10 weeks are going to be awful. So we had people submit like 2 or 3 ideas, and then we would say, actually, we would prefer you do your plan B because your plan A sucks. But now we've kind of done away with that by having everyone submit their ideas. Now we can kind of go through that all at the beginning and pick out which ones have the most potential. So instead of having to have each group and we pick 1 of 2, we now have, from about 40 to 80, 100, about 200 to 300 game ideas, and we can pick 10. It's much better odds. Anyway, so the reason why we have you all submit 2 to 3 as well is because the first idea you come up with isn't necessarily going to be the best one. And sometimes by having to revisit this and try to think again and again, you come up with things on the second time around after you've pushed out your first few ideas. You come up with things in your second or your third time around that ends up becoming much more like fresh because it wasn't what you would have thought of originally. Yeah. Anyway, so this is what we say. Like, your first idea isn't necessarily going to be the best. The other thing is that you're not going to come up with as good an idea on your own as you will if you have a chance to, spread this idea amongst others and kind of see what happens. Sometimes some of the best ideas come from just talking about your idea with other people and then having them say something that makes you think like, yeah, you know what, that's actually true. That would be a really interesting thing to do. And now suddenly your game idea has become so much better. Even if it's only to confirm that your idea is the best, right? The idea of putting it in front of other people, it helps to test the strength of your idea, just to see if it stands up to other people's criticisms or other people's suggestions. Anyway, the case is that there are lots of ways to be able to come up with ideas. So I know some people were saying, like, I don't have any good ideas to come up with. Well, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Often what we say is that there's inspiration to be found everywhere. And one of the things we're going to talk about is the notion of a producer. We said last time that a producer is the person who's generally in charge of the vision of a game. And so they're the ones who have an idea what the game's about. And when it comes to resolving questions about, should we have this element in the game? Should we have this part? How much are we trying to make this like scary versus happy? They're the ones who typically say, oh, this is meant to be a game that allows people to come away happy or participate with other people, or, so they have this idea in their mind. And all those things, those decisions are drawn from personal experience, and producers tend to have like a wealth of experience in particular areas that they use to inform what kind of game this is going to be. Sorry, just looking at the chat, do the game ideas have to be mechanic-based, or can they be setting narrative-based? They can use the setting of the narrative as the thing, that really like the secret sauce, but there has to be a game in it. One of the things we've seen in the past was, one of them was saying a game where, you try to find ways of staying warm during the pandemic. It's like, cool, theme was interesting, but I have no idea what this game is actually about, right? All it needed was a little bit more, just at least to address what that mechanic would be. Like, how would you do it? And, what would be the fun part of it, right? That's the part that kind of needs to be articulated before we can say this would be a good game. Otherwise, it's just a concept, that hasn't actually been fleshed out. But yeah, so that's why we say it doesn't have to be like all about the mechanic, like this is what they're going to do, run, jump, shoot, right? But there has to be this idea of like, what's going to be fun about this, right? And that's part of what we're talking about today. So anyway, this idea that producers tend to get their inspiration through a lot of the activities or experiences that they draw from. So when it comes to you, this is something we hope they would do as well, that you're trying to come up with a game idea, but this should also speak to you and what kind of things interest you, what kind of experiences you've had, because that will tap in, like you'll be tapping into that stuff when you're making your game. So if your game really speaks to some of, like, say, the life experiences you've had, or something that you feel strongly about, or something that, you imagine a good game to be about, then run with that, right? But again, come up with one idea and then find some other part of your personality that you can draw from to make another game idea, and so on. Okay, so for this, what we like to do is a little bit of an exercise, because sometimes this kind of idea of trying to brainstorm without having some structure to it can be, I don't know, a little limiting. So, so here's one thing that I like to do. Okay, what we've got here is we have a bunch of adjectives on one side and nouns on the other. So let me see, who is the most recent person to post something in the chat? Max. Hey, Max, can I borrow you for a second?
Sure. What's up?
All right, I need you to give me random number from 1 to 20.
20.
20. Okay. Give me another random number from 1 to 20.
15.
15. Okay, let's see how this goes. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Prehistoric. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Prehistoric soccer moms. Okay. All right, prehistoric soccer moms. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to split all of you into little groups, and I want you as a group to come up with like 2 or 3 ideas, like spitballing a bunch of ideas as to what a game about prehistoric soccer moms could be about. And we're going to come back in about 5 minutes and see what kind of things we come up with. All right. So let me just put people into breakout rooms for a second. Where's the breakout rooms thing? There it is. Let's say nope. Let's recreate it. Nope, not 100. There we go, 50. Okay. All right, that should do. All right, we're going to break out in for about 5 minutes and then come back and see what people have. Okay. All right, prehistoric soccer moms. All right, well, let's see what kind of ideas we came up with, right? I mean, every time we do this in person, what we usually do is we take these and we put them on little pieces of paper, and then we get people to draw, one from the adjectives and one from the nouns. And we're not saying that this is the way you make games. This is just a way of at least getting you thinking outside of whatever the first idea you come up with is. Partly because when you're going to get together in groups, even the game that you propose, the one that we accept, is going to have to change, right? It's going to have to modify itself for reasons that we're going to get to today. So the beginning of today is to at least go through an exercise of learning how to allow your brain to explore different options and embrace other possibilities. So let's go and get a couple samples. So let's see, room 1. I've got like Jackson, Justin, and Valerie. What did you come up with? What's one idea that you think that you would be willing to share?
I guess the more fleshed out one was we were thinking like, dinosaur parent trying to like drive or like, drive their kids, avoiding like, lava pits like in prehistoric settings to the soccer game, like that being a stressful thing, since like that's kind of very stereotypical like of like soccer moms or soccer dads trying to get their kids to the game. Another thing we were dabbling with is, how like it's also kind of stereotypical, like where parents kind of argue with other parents at sports games.
Okay.
So I guess I was thinking initially, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the game Oh Sir, like the insult simulator game, where it's basically you just combine words to insult the other person. So it would it's not fleshed out, but like I was thinking along those lines too.
Right. And it's true, right? You got two completely different styles. The first one has like the driving mechanic, and it has the prehistoric setting. Yeah. All right. Room 2, Bob and Murtaza. What do you got? What's an idea that you came up with?
Yeah, okay. Well, one of our ideas was very similar, actually, the driving thing. So I talk about another idea was basically we would be at a soccer game, but the soccer game is like a boulder instead. And basically you're a mom on the bleachers and you gotta cheer your kid on like Dance Dance Revolution style, I guess, to make them do better.
There is a
And,
game that
yeah.
what is it? It's like this Japanese one where you're supposed to be like this cheering squad, and
Yeah.
they go along with like all these other things, like this math Olympiad, and then they're on the side because it's like the high school cheer quad. I can't remember what it's called, but yeah.
I think I heard of that too, but I don't remember the name.
I gotta go find it, but yeah. Okay, room 3. We've got Angel, Evan, and Peiwen. What's an idea that came up in your room? Let's pick. Oh yeah. Okay.
I'm thinking maybe like they're all wearing like prehistoric clothing and like maybe the kids are playing soccer and then like prehistoric soccer.
Yeah. So it's just the exercise, right? And it's also one of the reasons why we do this is also so that you can see that a bunch of people come up with a bunch of different ideas, right? So whereas you as an individual may come up with a handful, the idea of sharing these ideas with others and using them in order to cross-pollinate and give yourself more inspiration for something else that would make your game better, this is common, right? And while they might not go to like this particular route, there's always exercises that every company likes to do in order to kind of gain the creativity from its entire workforce, at least in some ways. So some companies, what they'll do is they'll allow employees to submit game ideas, and they just get put into this pool. And if your idea gets selected, then you have the opportunity to take part of your time to work on a prototype for this game, just to see if this could be something that the game company could work on further. The other thing about it, and this is kind of part 2. Let's see. Well, okay, I guess in room 4. Can I have someone from room 4 tell me what their idea is? So we've got Dana, Ethan, and Zaylan. Who's going to volunteer?
I can volunteer, I guess.
Okay. Who's speaking right now?
Ethan.
Hi, Ethan. Okay, good. All right.
We had a couple ideas. I guess one of them would be like a fighting game where your characters are all like soccer moms and then sort of like a prehistoric aesthetic kind of background.
Okay. Well, you had another one?
Yeah, another one would be like, I don't know if you've ever played like The Forest or something, like a survival sort of game where you're being like chased or mobbed by soccer moms kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Did your group come up with 2, or were there more?
We had one where it's like a collectible sort of game.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right. So what I'm going to ask, and Ethan, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, is so you come up with 3 ideas, right? One of them's kind of like the soccer moms battling each other. One of them is, sorry, what was the first one again? It's the
fighting game, and then like a survival forest-esque, and then
a collectible game.
Collectibles game. Yeah.
Give me a 4th one.
Okay. Let's say I don't know, suppose you're like your character is the soccer ball and you're being chased by soccer moms or something. I don't know.
Okay, sure. Let's come up with a 5th one.
Okay.
Now we're starting to think, okay, well, where do I draw inspiration from to get another soccer mom game? Let's think about genres, right? Like, what is another, like you did one that was like a fighting game. You did one that was more like an escape game, one that was a collectible game. What other genres have we not explored yet? Like
What other
even,
genres?
like even sports, right? Like sports is a genre, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a simple one would be like a soccer game, but I feel like that's kind of unoriginal or like uncreative.
Except that the soccer moms get involved.
Yeah, maybe.
And they're all like dinosaurs.
They tag in. Oh, dinosaurs. I like that.
Right. See, this is where we go, right? There's two things about this exercise that we like to tap into. One is have everybody try to come up with ideas so that you can kind of see where everyone comes from, and you can hear ideas you wouldn't have thought of yourself. The second that we tend to do is we would actually call on people in class to come up with, there's 3, and then a 4th one, and then a 5th one, and then a 6th one. And the act of doing this pushes you to go into areas that you wouldn't have considered first, right? Because you would have had a natural intuition about saying, okay, well, this is going to be kind of a battling thing because soccer moms are kind of highly combative with each other. And then there's another one that says, okay, well, maybe it's something where you're trying to escape and there's a bunch of soccer moms chasing after you. And then there's one where maybe you're like, you're collecting items, and one that where you're the ball, and then one where, and the more you go, like the more you start to explore things that aren't the first thing they came up with. And this is a big deal in this course, to be able to get kind of out of what you're fixed on or what your concept of games is going to be into all the things that it could be instead. Okay, so anyway, thank you very much for all of you who have volunteered to help with this. Getting back to this process. So now that we've at least acknowledged how these ideas are different and where they can go. Oh yeah, if you had an idea that you wanted to share because it was actually, pretty funny, please put it in the chat. We'll make sure to tap into it. But the idea, what we're doing here is just being able to at least explore the state space of ideas to make sure that at least whatever you submit or whatever you decide to fix on for your final game, like it's the best idea that could have been come up with, while exploring the range of possibilities. So the next thing is, okay, we've picked one, whichever one we decide has the most potential. The idea of, soccer moms that are actually, I almost imagine something where soccer moms, jump in while the soccer game is being played and they have to participate without being caught. Right? Like that can, and then if they did get caught, then the ref like sends them off. So I can see that being, I don't know, I'm not even sure what that kind of game is like. It's, kind of capture the flag, kind of, like those, like a stealth game. I don't know what. It's okay, Mom. Sorry. That's awesome. All right, so once we do pick something, right? Because eventually you have to pick something. The idea is, how do we then take this thing and tune it to make it a great game? This is something that's going to happen throughout the course, but at the beginning, there is some ideas of like, where do we go in terms of the pitch, right? Our pitch has to be, the coolest idea that we imagine making before we get right into it. So usually what happens is that at this stage, there is, especially at big companies, like a huge process that goes into making these ideas shine. And, some of these involve things like focus groups. Some of them involve, like consulting others. Some of them involve even just making a bunch of prototypes or, looking at other game ideas that you can steal. Whatever the case, the basic stages that most people look at is, one, they consider their audience. Again, looking at focus groups to figure out, who are we targeting and what kind of game does that group want? And then looking at the kind of experience you want to create, for that audience. This ties into the game mechanic stuff we did before, so we'll tap into that briefly. And then being able to say, based on that experience, what kind of things can I add into this game to be able to enhance, the original idea in order to create the experience that we want. So it's always with that kind of push and pull. So let's talk about these, because again, this is part of the game design process that you may not have considered, but really needs to be done. So fun. Fun is not the same thing for all people. You're not going to make a game that everyone's going to like. And so with that in mind, you have to start figuring out kind of things about your audience to say, who is it that we're targeting and what is it that we want to do for them? So so the series of questions like, who is your audience going to be? What kind of things are generally enjoyed by this group? What kind of things do they typically partake in, and what kind of things, like activities, do we understand that they enjoy? A lot of research goes into this kind of thing. That's what marketing people have to do, right? What kind of experience do you want them to have? So if you know what things they like, what kind of thing do you think what kind of experience would you want to create that you think they would enjoy? And what do you want to do for that group? And then this is constrained by what resources you have, right? You might want to do things where, they can play a full field, like a full field soccer mom game through VR. Yeah, that's not going to happen in this course, because we can't assume that the people who are on the other end of Discord necessarily have VR set up. And how are we going to do that given, Wi-Fi connections? There's just certain limitations that you have to accept, in some cases, embrace. And then budget, right? What can we do? We have this grand idea, but we've only got a certain amount of time. We've only got a certain number of people or money. Or in the past, it used to be disk space, that when things were on physical media, there was a limit to how much you could actually put onto one of these disks. So you had to make trade-offs in terms of the experience you had. That we'll talk about a little bit too. But anyway, the idea of the producer is that the person who's got the vision has to be mindful of all these different things in order to try to come up with an experience that fits within the constraints you've got, but also manages to target your group with an experience that you want them to have. So I'm gonna tell you a story. This story involves when the course first started. I was doing some research of my own. So I went over to EA Sports in Vancouver because I knew one of the people there, the university contacts. And I said I would like to shadow one of the teams during their development process. So, so they let me come in, had to sign like a million NDAs, but they let me shadow FIFA Street 3. I don't know if anyone remembers FIFA Street 3. Not a lot of people do, but it was at least a good experience to be able to see kind of how their team put this together. So at the time, what they were doing is they had to consider what their audience was. So I got to speak to the producer. And FIFA is interesting because if you look at all of the EA Sports games, the one that sells the most is FIFA. And why is that? Well, because of the size of the audience for soccer or football is the largest out of all the sports teams. They said in Canada, the biggest audience, or the most prominent, was NHL series. And in the US, of course, it's like Madden. But in the world, globally, FIFA outsells all of those. And it's not like the percentage uptake is high, that, every person who's a soccer fan picks up one of their games. But it's just that even with a smaller percentage of their target audience, with a large target audience, they still manage to outsell any of the other sports titles that they've got. So what they were saying is that the reason for this is because they want to tap into the soccer sports, the soccer sports enthusiasts. So that's the FIFA part. But remember this title, FIFA Street 3. The street part is that they don't want something that's necessarily an authentic, realistic experience. They want something that's a little bit more exaggerated, something that's got, more interesting, like power-ups, things that are a little hyper-real. And that's kind of what you're going for when you're getting like the Street series. And the 3, well, they're tapping into an audience that's already probably bought into FIFA Street 1 or 2, or at least has seen the track record of those games and is interested in tapping into whatever the newest offering is. So each of those things has, a certain weight to it. And it's not like they came up with this title lightly, right? Like they knew going into this, we were making a sequel to the original. And so there is an audience that they need to tap into, and they need to be thinking about when they put this stuff together. They're not going to make this for themselves. That's a hard statement to make. The idea is that they're supposed to be making this for this audience, but they might choose a producer who best reflects that audience in terms of the kinds of decisions they make. Anyway, audience is a big deal. Then you have to say, okay, well, what kind of things does the audience enjoy? This is where they took to the streets. and they did a lot of research, like tapping into people who had played past titles, tapping into people who, were big on, the like the fan boards for the previous games, or fan boards for like FIFA or soccer in general. They tapped into people who were kind of big on popular culture. And the reason why they did that was to try to figure out, what kind of things would people enjoy. Like it's very much like targeting kind of the maximum payback in terms of the experience they want to create. And they use that in order to help tailor their experience. So, they came up with the idea that they wanted to have the ability to do like tricks and combos and have this thing be like, larger than life, as opposed to something which is like a meticulously authentic experience. So they wanted to get to that, but they got to that stuff later. What they did first was they had to try to figure out what the core gameplay was, and then they came back to all those other things after the fact. But this is kind of part of the harvesting of ideas, is that they want to think about this stuff, but they still need to come up with a mechanic. So I got to meet the producer. It's interesting because he was the franchise producer for 8 of EA Sports' titles, but his origins was as a DJ. He didn't come in with any kind of past game development experience. He wouldn't be able to develop a game if he needed to. The idea was, though, that his experience was in things like popular culture and understanding the mindset of the people who are going to play this game. So he was at the helm of this thing, and I don't know, he's now like the head of his own studio. But anyway, so the idea was that they brought somebody in who was going to helm the game, who didn't have any experience in game development, but he knew what people liked. So he would make the decisions on what should go into this game, and it was up to the teams to be able to bring that vision to fruition. So what he wanted to try to do was, he said, okay, well, let's look at the mechanics first. We want to be able, like, again, it's tapping into all the things that we're used to, things like, being able to control players and navigate them in order to enact some kind of strategy to be able to get to the goal. They also had aspects of like resource management in there as well, because between games, they wanted to be able to manage their teams and want to be able to have these teams, make their way through the standings. So there was all these kinds of mechanic issues. And then when it came to the experience, again, he came to the core audience and found out that some of the things that brought them the most gratification was this feeling of agency, being able to take control of some of the players that they were big fans of and have them do all these amazing things. And so this idea of power, the aesthetic quality to it was part of it. This was the street aspect. They actually went to a bunch of locales and they took samples from things like, I think one of them was on like an oil rig, like the helipad on an oil rig was one of their play areas. They had one that was kind of in the mountains of South America. And so they went in and they took samples from all these things so that, players could have the experience of playing in all these amazing global locales. Anyway, so that's where kind of all of these things came from. So it was interesting, right? Like finding out how people, before they even touch code, like put a lot of effort into understanding like what it is that we're trying to accomplish with this game, right? To make it that it's not just, I come up with an idea, I'm going to make this because I want to make a game. It's to think, well, how do I make people really like this game? How do I make people respond? And in that way, you're almost crafting an experience that, you're trying to almost manipulate your player. And if that seems a little, I don't know, if it seems, a little cold, I mean, it don't mean to be, it's just this thing, right? Like you're always trying to be aware of your player when you're making stuff. And so thinking about what they want and trying to give it to them is one of the crucial parts about making your game, not about doing something for yourself, thinking about like who's going to play this and how do I maximize the experience they have. So this brings us to our course, right? We have to ask these questions. And the reason why I'm making this up is because people in the past have not asked these questions. They made a game for themselves and they forgot to think about the fact that they're presenting it for other people. And like this was problematic because people made a game that they enjoyed, but other people, like no one else did, or because they had a certain experience in mind, but they couldn't communicate it. So we ask you to ask these questions to be able to at least be aware of what kind of things you need to communicate when you're doing your pitch. So our audience, I mean, It's largely game development professionals because that's who we bring in to give feedback. Incidentally, the first feedback session, which is going to take place, I think, a week from today, we've got a few people coming by. So the guy who made A Short Hike, he's going to be coming by. We've got, who else? Someone who, like, he was running the this thing called Gamer Camp. It was like this game arts festival that took place for about 8 years. He'll be coming by. So we've got all these people. You know, they're the ones who are going to come by to look at your games and give you feedback on them. What do they enjoy? Well, in general, they like any kind of genre if it's done well, right? Like they see a really good shooter or a really good exploration game, they like that stuff. But in particular, when they come to this class, what they're looking for is something different, something weird, something that anybody who's in the field would never have thought of because they have to fulfill some sort of business objective. But here they can see stuff that is like wild and crazy and fascinating, you know, because there's no consequence if your strange idea doesn't work. So what experience are you creating? Again, well, this is very specific to your game, so it's hard to answer here, but you have to be able to answer this when time comes. And what resources do you have? Well, we've got this team. It's going to have like a certain portion of U of T computer science people, U of T, excuse me, U of T faculty of music people, and various artists from OCAD. This is going to create wildly different skill sets. Some people at OCAD are going to be good at illustration, some are good at 3D art, some are good at, oh boy, you know, graphic design, you know, technical artistry. There's going to be a bunch of different things. And so the game you make has to take that into account to say that you can't just make anything you want, but you have to make what you can with the ingredients you got. Kind of like food, right? No matter what kind of dish you might want to make, you have to have the ingredients for it. If you have the best chefs are the ones who can take the ingredients and make something amazing from it. Same from the computer science side. We have a series of requirements for getting into the course, but they can be anything from graphics to AI to HCI to software engineering. Those are going to help inform what kind of game you're able to make. Like, what is your area of expertise? You know, if you got graphics, then there's a possibility of doing something that's got a lot of visual aesthetic or some interesting visual tricks. If you've got like AI, they can start bringing in some interesting algorithms that can make some emergent behaviors, right? But you got to know who you've got in your roster to be able to make something out of that. So even if you come up with an interesting game, you're going to want to modify that based on the skill set that you've got when your team gets formed. What is your budget? In this case, well, money is not exactly the issue. Well, it is in that we can't just buy you like a full development rig on the PS5. Working on it. But we've got time, right? 10 weeks to put this together. Limits the scope of what you can make. 8 teammates, you know, also says what kind of limitations do you have in terms of manpower to be able to actually develop the game. These are things that all have to be considered to make sure a game can fit these constraints and give you the experience you're trying to get. So, okay. So this is basically all just talking about your audience, right? Thinking about your audience, what it is that they want, and what is it that you're going to give them. And this idea doesn't change. You know, at the beginning of this is what we're talking about, thinking about who you're targeting to help tailor your game for that audience. But we're also going to see it at the design stage when we try to make our levels and our character designs in order to make something that, again, the audience is going to respond to. And at the end, more than anything, playtesting. After you make your first playable prototype, we spend about 2 weeks playtesting it. That's why we've been in discussions right now with Ubisoft and when we're going to go and do this virtual meeting or like a virtual field trip through Discord. But the idea is you're going to be getting player feedback and using that to inform how your game's going to change. It's all about your audience and all about your player, and not about, well, yes, it's about you and your vision to a certain extent. You need to make sure that it's not at the expense of the people who are going to play this. So that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Once you come up with this, you've used all this feedback and all this information to help make an idea of what your game is going to be, where it's going to sit, and what it's going to look like. Now we have to make it. And this is something where we like to address that, you know, oh, has anyone ever seen this game? Yeah, like one person. Okay, some people have actually seen this game before. Do you remember the name of it? Yep. You're very, very close when you say Castle Crashers. I think it's something more like Crash the Castle or something like that. Anyway, so of course, some people recognize this, some people don't. This one's much more recognizable, right? So the idea behind it is that it's the same thing, right? The same concept, where you're basically taking objects, throwing them to knock down certain structures. But in the execution of it, that's where one game manages to make things work and one game doesn't so much. But underlining it, it's like they still have some of the same mechanics. They still have the same idea of like interaction. They're just little things that can help make one game successful and another game not. So yeah, Crash the Castle. There we go. So what we always talk about is we start off with something that's got the core game mechanics, right? Because it's hard to build a game around something where you don't think about the mechanics of a game until at the end. The main exception for some of these things is, things that are built around a certain IP. That's kind of hard, right? That's one where you start off with the aesthetics first, and then you have to try to figure out what kind of game could fit into this aesthetic. This is kind of like the prehistoric soccer moms thing, right? You're trying to figure out a genre that can fit to make this thing work. But in general, because in this course, we get to start from the beginning, you can think about what this is going to look like. What is the main thing that your game is going to do? Like, what is the main focus of it? And you have to keep it tight, right? You can't be thinking about making something that does like 3 different genres in one. You have to make something that says, okay, well, you might be able to pull off like 2, but it has to be a single activity or interaction that the player is going to have to focus on, because they don't have a lot of time to really get to know your game. They need to be able to like taste this one experience and feel like they got this like rich flavor from it. So this is why we say it's okay to take advantage of like certain genres to be able to tap into something that has already familiar, so that players don't have to try to figure out what the game is. It's like, oh, this is a platformer. Oh, this is a narrative game. This one's like an exploration game. Like they tapping into something that they're already familiar with is good, while also having something that makes it a little bit different, like something that's kind of unique, right? The endless runner, where you do the whole thing backwards, right? Okay, I get the endless runner, and doing it backwards is not something I would have considered before. Let's see how this works, right? Or doesn't work. So this is just idea of like, we're going to want you to come up with something that is small, familiar, with enough of a twist that people can adapt to the twist and be able to see where this takes this game in like a different direction than what they'd expect. So what we advise is what's called, prototyping, rapid prototyping. Remember what we did in the game jam? We basically got you to make a game in 6 hours, right? And it wasn't necessarily a pretty game. I mean, there were some, right? That had some potential. Mosquito Simulator, could see that being like the next Angry Birds. But the idea behind it is that you can make something and like see how it works, and then be able to use that to say, like, I think this could actually make a good game if only we were doing like this tiny little change, like making it so that as you're playing the mosquito, there is a sense of like the camera being able to follow it, so that you don't completely lose where the player is, or where your victim is supposed to be. But idea is that this is an invaluable part of any team's game formation. Is the idea that we have this idea, it works in theory. Let's try a couple of iterations to figure out which version of it is going to work the best. So usually what they'll do is they'll start off with something. They'll make a basic mechanic behind how this thing is meant to be interacted with. They'll start adding some features to it to help kind of like adding herbs to a dish to help bring out some flavor. And then they start putting in all these other elements. So what we're going to find is that, like, remember how we have, the U of T groups are going to be doing a lot of these first few stages. Once we get down to the last few, that's about when the Yo-Ken people are going to be tapping or stepping in and providing that other side of it. But it's going to be your responsibility to be able to come up with the first few stages, at least to make the mechanics of it like something that works functionally, before we can find ways of trying to enhance kind of the feeling that you get from the game. So we talked a little bit about the solid mechanic idea, saying that a game mechanic has got to define how the players are meant to interact with the game. And ultimately, if this is something that's like a game is basically an interactive experience. So you have to figure out, what is the main interaction going to be? Some examples that we typically showed. Oops, right. You have building mechanics. Again, the idea of building something is fine, but then the prototyping is where you go through the different iterations of how this could look and what kind of things could this be about, in order to be able to kind of settle on the aesthetic and the final mechanic for this game. Right, so the idea that you're going to make a building game is good, but without the prototyping, there's no way to be able to know exactly what this building game strategy would be like. Yep, World of Goo. Now we'll just see it to the end, right? There we go. There we go. And of course, to complement the building game, there's the breaking ones, right? I don't know if anyone recognizes this game. This is a game that was produced by Steven Spielberg once upon a time. And incidentally, it predates Angry Birds. Oh, Steven Spielberg does everything, So this was actually played on the Switch. Or so not the Switch, it was played on the Wii. So you would use, you press one button on the Wiimote in order to drag the camera around to be able to look at different views. And then the other button was used to kind of hold on to an object and then throw it using, the motion controls. Anyway, this game was called Boom Blocks. The idea behind it was that you're supposed to see how many throws it took for you to knock down all of the translucent blocks of a certain color. See, look, it's even got the 1, 2, 3 stars, and yes, all the side characters were all block-shaped animals. Yep. So yeah, this idea is not new, right? The idea of what Angry Birds did was something that had existed many, many times. All they managed to do is to find a way of taking it and making it, easier, more accessible, But again, we'll talk a little bit more later about some of those aspects, like why Angry Birds was the right game on that platform at the time. You can kind of see where this is going, right? Again, very much like Angry Birds, that satisfying feeling of watching the entire structure fall down. And of course, my favorite, the rolling mechanic, right? But we talked a little bit about this during the bit about game mechanics, right? But all these things, they tap into things that are familiar and inherently fun. Like right now, you can go outside and start rolling up snowballs, and there's an inherent balance in terms of the difficulty. You start off with something that's easy because it's small, but the longer you go, the more that it builds up kind of an inherent challenge as the ball gets bigger and more unwieldy. right? So there is kind of built into there like a really interesting not only mechanic but also kind of like a leveling mechanism. Anyway, so what's wrong with looking at features? So I should really take out that little artifact. So when we talk about things, we talk about mechanics versus features, right? And I keep on telling everybody, like, don't think about features because the features are going to be like the thing that mires you. Like, you need to think of the mechanic first. And so the feeling is, after a while, though, it's like, but why? Why are features supposed to be bad, right? Because that's what people think about when they think about games. The main thing we're trying to say is that because we're game developers, we have to be able to do more than just what the player sees, but we have to look underneath it and understand what is it that the player is actually enjoying, right? You know, the things that you see are great, like, you know, they're enhancements like the body of a car, but, you know, underlying it, there has to be some of the actual the substance that's going to be like the game is built on, that, you know, the features help to enhance. So that's why we say, you know, when people create a good game, it creates or it leads to a set of features that people notice. But if people start with the kinds of features that they like, then, you know, there's no way of guaranteeing that's going to necessarily lead to a good game. One example I like to put is, you know, this clip from Rocket League, which inherently is a great mechanic and a great idea. The only problem is when they get a little bit too caught up in some of their own features, it kind of leads to things like this. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Rocket League is the idea that you're playing a giant soccer game, but your main players are cars. Okay, I'm going to stop this. Like I said, nothing against Rocket League. Rocket League is inherently like a very like cool, cute concept. It's not something. It's something that could have easily come up from this course, right? We're going to make a soccer game where instead of having people, you're going to use cars to be able to knock the ball around. That could very easily have been an idea in this course. And the execution of it was always great. Like it was fun. But the thing about this is that at some point in a lot of games development, they get entirely too enamored with the features that they offer, such that this trailer here, like it spent an entire time just talking about how we can get like 2-player, 3-player, 4-player, 8-player split screens. We've got 50 billion different combinations. It's like, well, yes, that's kind of how combinations work. You know, this bringing in a play like the PS4 exclusive, and so the whole thing seemed to be just like even things like the dedicated server. Like it was unclear at some point, you know, why the people who were putting this trailer together felt that, you know, the dedicated server was the thing that, you know, people who hadn't played Rocket League before were really looking for in order to be able to make this purchase. And yes, Sweet Tooth is from Twisted Metal. That was like 20 years ago. Anyway, so this idea, like the concept of it is great, but instead of being able to kind of play into that concept, like the whole thing that was being bombarded was just a set of features. And this comes up a lot when it comes to sequels. A game might have a great success, and then as people try to figure out how to take that, you know, that lightning in a bottle and reproduce it, that's where people tend to fall over each other. So for this, I mean, in the chat, I would like you to mention what movies had a great first outing and then a terrible second one. All right? Train to Busan had a second? Huh. Okay. Cars, Matrix, Frozen, Pacific Rim. Most Marvel movies. Well, yeah. I think Thor was yeah, okay, I agree with Thor. I think Captain America actually managed to do the second one pretty well. So it seemed pretty hit and miss, depending on who the directors are. But I mean, is that all? We can't think of any other movies. How about things like Speed? Do you remember there was Speed 2? Yeah, like any kind of horror movie, right? Like you've got like Paranormal Activity, right? Okay, that was cool. Or Final Destination. Like what are they up to now? Final Destination 6? Like I think they misunderstand the word final. Space Jam. Space Jam. And yeah, there was a Speed 2 where they're on a cruise ship, and it's Sandra Bullock's character is with some like new guy, which, you know, whatever. And then and it's called Speed 2 Cruise Control because they're on a ship that can't slow down. Yeah. Fast and Furious is interesting. That one we can have a whole debate on because it seems like the second one was trying to recreate whatever the first one did. And then they just decided, hell with it. And they just decided to go this whole other route, you know, a very much like Vin Diesel, Jason Statham, and The Rock route. And they just, yeah, what was it originally about? Family? I guess so. Whatever. Let's go do this thing. Yeah, so this is the idea, right? Like it's common. It's so common that it's almost become kind of a tired thing to complain about sequels because the first movie did an amazing job at something, and then, you know, they try to recreate it. But of course, when they try to recreate it, they're looking at this movie after it's come out, and they're looking at these things about it, and then saying, all we need is these things in order to make another good outing. Like the Marvel movie that I find as a counterexample is like, you know, Captain America starts off as like a period piece World War II movie, and then the second one becomes more like a suspense spy thriller movie, right? Don't even try. They're just like, you know what, the thing that's common, the thing that's the core is the character, right? If you have these characters doing this other scene, it doesn't really matter what they do. Captain America could be trying to take down Hydra, or he could be, you know, trying to open up like a food truck and travel across the United States. Either way, you know, people would watch it because you want to see what's going on with him, not necessarily like the stuff around him. Yeah, anyway, this shows up in games, right? And we've all seen these things where people have taken an existing franchise that has done really well, and then they try to recreate it by taking what the original game did, but also not focusing on what was core about this game. The one that I have issue with is the one on the top left. This was Prince of Persia. When it came out, you know, it was this great like parkour kind of game that took place in a vaguely Persian environment or setting. But the idea behind it was like, yeah, this was a great game. It was like well-designed puzzles. And so for the sequel, what they did was they made him like edgy, you know, they made him dark. They brought in a lot of like heavy metal music as the background. And this idea was like, you know what, we'll take this thing, like, let's take this game and make it edgy. Has never been the good solution to making a sequel. And yeah, it actually did become kind of the vaulting point for Assassin's Creed, right? Because Assassin's Creed was all about the parkour type stuff too, but in a different setting that, you know, took away all the things that they were trying to do with the Prince of Persia sequels. They kind of, like into the two, yeah, that's the thing. I was there at the time. I remember playing Prince of Persia, and then Assassin's Creed came out. I was like, what is this derivative stuff, huh? And then after a while, Assassin's Creed still lives, and Prince of Persia had like one half-hearted reboot and then never really made it. Anyway, the idea is, why am I talking about sequels, right? why am I talking about sequels? Is because of this idea of the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic says that what people notice isn't necessarily the thing that's most important about a situation or about a person, right? Like you'll think about things like when it comes to trying to characterize people, you'll notice certain things, like the way someone looks, how tall someone is, the way someone speaks, and those kinds of things. The things that are most readily available and most easy to notice are the things that people tend to use when characterizing something. But often what happens is that judging a person, requires you to look at things that are deeper than just what's visible and what's available. And the same thing goes on with games. People, when they look at games, they look at the way that they, like what kind of things they do, right? It's like, oh, like if you look on Metacritic, people notice certain characteristics of games, right? This game offers co-op gameplay. This one offers online game modes. This one has the ability to go through 50 different levels. This one allows you to play as all these different kind of characters. They're very much the salient features of these games. But what they often miss is kind of what the core game elements are about that helps to provide the foundation for all the things that come on top of it. Are the series that are always good? Portal, yeah. Games that are always good. I'm gonna have to think about this one later. Anyway, so this is the idea, right? I take a little sidestep into the notion of features and designing stuff around features, just to help provide some sort of caution to say features are very important, but they're just not important at the stage where you're trying to figure out what the core of your game is going to be about. The features are the things that come on top of that, kind of like the toppings on a hot dog. You need the hot dog first, and then the toppings can help enhance the experience, right? If you think I can put toppings on anything and have it taste good, like, yeah, well, let's see. So anyway, then we get to the point where we say, okay, we've got all these different levels that we need to get through, and we'll get through them at different points in the course of this class. But when we have the core, the underlying mechanic of how this is going to work, then we can start thinking about what comes next. This is when the features come in. Once you've got this core mechanic where you know exactly what this game's going to be about and it's inherently fun, then you try to find things that you can do to enhance it. Right? So I'm not saying that features are bad and not part of the design process at all, but they just have a place. And that place comes after you figured out what the game's going to be like at its core. And these features come throughout the game development process. So the first, I guess I just want to tap into is when you're coming up with your game, when you're trying to pitch this thing, you need to be able to think about a bunch of stuff. So like what the core mechanic is going to be, and then what kind of enhancements you put on. And the one thing I need to draw attention to before we part for the day is the interface being one of those things you need to think about. And when I talk about this, people are usually like, but what's the big deal about interfaces? Interfacing is going to be a crucial part of your gameplay experience here because we don't have the availability to do anything we want. And this is something that came up last year. Because we're doing things online, and it's possible that we might be online for the foreseeable future. You have to think about, okay, what kind of experience do you actually have access to? We can't do like a Johann Sebastian joust where people are in a room together with these motion-based controllers and they're doing some kind of physical activity. We're basically virtual. We have to resign ourselves that we're going to probably be virtual for most of the semester. Are we going to have access to any kind of controller we want, right? Could we use like the Ring Fit to be able to act as an interface device? I mean, that would be great, but I think we've kind of got limitations there too. What's the most that we can help, or what's the most that we can expect? Maybe keyboards, maybe controllers, right? That's like, we have to think about that stuff when it comes to making whatever game we're going to try to make. Would the people who are playing our game be able to do local multiplayer? I wouldn't say local, but what we've done in the past is we've used Parsec. So Parsec is the tool that allows you to be able to host a game on your computer and then have people, play remotely. It's what most people did last year. The only times that people didn't was like if they weren't doing a multiplayer game, then they could host it on WebGL. So then it could just be on a single site that other people would tap into, and then they could play it independently. But for multiplayer, Parsec was basically the only solution that really worked. And even then, when I say really worked, I really want to put quotes around that. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why we have, right after the design doc, the next milestone is that you have to demonstrate a level to Karthik. And part of this is because if you're going to be using something like Parsec, make it work for him, and then we can put it in front of our guests. But he is going to be the one who helps you test out these things just to make sure it can work with somebody completely new. Anyway, the control thing, like, it goes beyond just, like, when it talks about interfaces, it's not just about devices, but also about how you're going to communicate these things. How are people going to be able to communicate with your game? And this is something that nobody thinks about. But bad controls can seriously tank your game. And everybody kind of treats this as like an afterthought to say, all right, I want to have something, button. We're going to have a button that's, is like strong punch, and we'll have a button for weak punch, and we'll have a button for strong kick, and a button for weak kick, and we'll have a button for jump, and we'll have a button for block, and then we'll have another one that uses your special ability. And you would be surprised at how much this happens, where people come up with this huge list of things that they want the characters to do, and this maps itself onto an interface where there's more buttons than the human hand has fingers. But people don't think about this stuff because their main focus has been just like making the game and like putting this thing together in Unity. But this has to be something you think about. And this is the stage where you think about it, because the choice of interface informs the kind of interactions you have with your game. Right? So you can't be thinking of this thing like after you've done everything else. You have to be thinking about, how is my player going to play with this? And what kind of interactions am I going to allow to be able to make this experience really good? So this is where I talk about things like, power, orthogonality, responsiveness. Responsiveness is just saying that your game reacts in response to the player doing something. Power just is meaning that when your player is going to be using your game, there's things that they're going to want to do. The worst thing you can do is to say, oh, no, you can't do that, right? No, you can't pick that up. No, you can't actually interact with that thing. You should never be able to say you can't. If the player wants to do something, even if it's not what you originally had planned for them to do, you let them do it, right? You got to make sure that they can actually do the things that your game makes them want to do. And if it requires you to pivot your game as a result, that's kind of the unfortunate thing, but the reason why you put this in front of people before you get too locked into a particular gameplay. Rapid prototyping, right? The prototyping is the stage that helps you understand where your game could go so that your pitch, your design embraces the possibilities instead of locking yourself into a particular way of playing and having that be the only thing that the player can do. Orthogonality is the 10-button interface issue. If you can, you need to limit the number of buttons that the player is going to have to control. If you can make it something like they have like the WASD buttons to help control the direction they go, and maybe like one other button for some action they can do, that's considered to be ideal, right? Narrows down the interface so that your game becomes about navigation and interaction, but it doesn't have like 4 or 5 different kinds of interactions to be able to try to handle what kind of things you want the player to do. You have to try to narrow it down. And again, if this requires narrowing the scope of your game, then again, so be it. So you see why I'm talking about interfaces here? It's not because that's kind of the initial stage that goes into your pitch. It's because you have to be looking ahead to what your player is going to do, and then think about how your game is responding to that. Are they going to be saddled with 10 different things that they're going to have to manage in their heads? Is the page that's going to show them the control scheme going to require them to take a picture of it so that they can memorize exactly how they're supposed to work with your game? Every game does this. Every game in the past has always done this thing that says, here are our controls. And there would be like 8 or 9 different things that this audience who is playing a game for the first time has to somehow like get into their head to say like, oh, so I've got some like these different kinds of attacks, and I've got this special ability, and I need to push this button in order to charge it up, and that just makes them feel like, what is this, right? I feel like I'm trying to handle like this complex puzzle mechanic in the control structure itself. So anyway, so this is why we say in the design or in the pitch stage, when you're doing this, you may not be actually working with your controllers until the next stage, but you have to be at least thinking about what kind of interaction the player is going to have and what kind of experience you need to tailor around whatever controls they're limited to. So, just make this the thing that helps, make the controls and the experience of interacting with your game simple and rewarding. And of course, the clip that I always like to show when it comes to how controls can affect the enjoyment of a game is this one. I can't remember which Assassin's Creed this one was, but there was, Assassin's Creed has always been kind of notorious for having the character act in a way that is maybe accurate to what you did, but not to what you wanted to do. Now, while you're watching this, I want you to suggest, in the chat, what kind of things could the developers of this have done in order to spare the player this agony? What would you do? How would you solve this? Again, we're not at this stage yet. This is more like the alpha stage when you actually have to modify your playable prototype, make it not possible to jump in the water. I mean, I guess that's the thing. They want them to be able to, but yeah. Yep. So yes, while part of what this game is about is the idea of being able to navigate through these kind of labyrinth levels to figure out the way out. And they're usually pretty good about drawing attention to where you need to go. See, like the camera pans out, so you know you need to get that bar. But the difficulty here is that the controls don't provide the responsiveness and, oops, too loud. The responsiveness or the control, like the power that you want, right? Like you want to be able to have the sense of agency that you have, if you know what you want the player to do, and you just want the character to be able to do it, right? And while yes, there's a certain challenge of like, oh, if I don't quite get it, then I'm going to fall in. The idea that if the player is even giving some indication that they know what they want or what needs to be done, that you try to help map the character's behavior according to the player's intention, not their actual, not the actual inputs that they give. And I mean, this is painful, right? But all of you are going to do this. You're all going to get to the point where you realize that your controls are having, like you can control the character and it's doing things, but it's not doing what the player intends. It's just doing exactly what the character has been instructed to do based on their inputs, right? So the reason why I bring this up is because, yeah, this is something that always happens. And there's actually been a lot of stories where, like, we go to things like game developer conferences where we get to see people who've developed these games talk about the lessons that they learned in terms of tailoring their interfaces or how they work with their playtesting group in order to polish these. And one of the games I remember hearing from was the people who made Bejeweled. Incidentally, that was interesting because they're actually a Canadian company originally. And yeah, so they were talking about making Bejeweled, which is again like one of those match 3 games that happens on mobile devices. And what they were saying was that like, because when you tap onto a mobile screen, it registers as kind of like a blob at a particular coordinate. And that blob can vary in terms of like whether you're pressing it with your finger, your thumb, or the size of your digits. It's just all these things that can kind of make that blob's position imprecise. So what they did was they actually looked in the range around where the person tapped on the screen to find what was the move that would have created the maximum score. And then that was the move that they did. So it wasn't that they actually moved the jewel that you tapped, it moved the jewel that they assumed you wanted to tap in order to be able to get some, like some cool interaction. So this is why the idea is like controls are a big deal and something that needs to be considered at some point. If it was a different semester, we would talk about what kind of interface devices you could use. And my office is filled with a whole bunch of these kinds of devices. I've got things like Rock Band drum pads, Wii Fit balance boards. Like these, like the bongo drums from various things. I've got all these devices that people have used in the past in order to be able to make their games more fun. But perhaps not this year. Anyway, so this is one of the things when you're making your games, it's one of the things we would urge you to consider, even if the controls are something that's not going to come up seriously until your design document, only because you want to make sure that you're thinking about the interaction your player is going to have when trying to come up with the really fun aspects of your game. And in the end, the main thing that you're trying to do, and this is kind of the last slide I'm going to touch on today, we'll touch on the ludology later after you've actually started to make your game, is think about what the game feel is for your game. And if you're not familiar with the term, it basically is what the term describes, right? It is the feeling that you get when playing this game. And is it sort of this, what kind of experience do you want people to have? So we'd say, in this case, this is a game that I think it was part of what PlayStation was giving out for free in the middle of the pandemic. This one is a game, it's like a scuba diving game called Abzu. And there, the whole thing, like, there is a certain amount of navigation present, but not really. It's one of those things where you'd have to be trying to get lost in order to not know where you need to go. But the whole idea is the game feel. Like, what is it both aesthetically and the controls and, the overall gameplay that creates this kind of this sensation, right? This feeling of flow that you're going to have as you go through the different levels of this game. So what do you want to do, right? You're putting together this game idea. Maybe you've submitted your ideas by now, maybe you haven't. But let's say you haven't. What kind of thing do you want to, what kind of experience do you want to create in the player, right? Like what would make you happy to have the player feel? And then from there, okay, so what kind of mechanic could you use in order to make that feeling happen? What kind of thing could they do to help create this feeling? And then once you have that, you have an idea of what the mechanic is, like how would they interact with this so that the interaction is feeling natural for this aesthetic? And then what kind of added features would help to enhance that basic mechanic to create this feeling, and then get rid of all the other features that you could add that don't actually go towards this goal. So this is kind of like the thesis of today's class. You want to create this feel. You do it by looking at what kind of things they could do in order to make it happen, and then what features you would add in order to enhance the feeling. And that's all you can do at this stage when coming up with ideas for your game. This is all I have. It's about 2:30. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Either related to this or something else. Again, in terms of what you need to do for this week, we're collecting all of the game ideas by this evening around 6. We are going to spend the next 24 hours or so going over all of them in order to come up with whatever the 10 ideas that have the most potential. We will be contacting those 10 people to let them know we're going to try to form groups later on the day on Friday, and we'll let everyone else in the class know, here are the 10 ideas and the people who you want to write to if you want to work on that person's idea. Is the limit on the length of the game ideas we submit strict? No, but it's just, there's some where, oh my God, it's like this huge paragraph, and just like having to get through the whole thing, like you get lost trying to figure out what the game is. So like we had to kind of go through it and just be like highlighting, like, here's where the game is in all of this. So the limit is not to say that we aren't going to accept anything above that length, but to help you focus on keeping your ideas, easily expressible and not getting lost in a bunch of details that won't be relevant to, us figuring out what your game is. Is it possible to not be a team leader after a game is formed? It's possible. It's hard because we'd like to have somebody understand what the vision is for this game. So if your game is picked and you don't want to be, then we'll give you the opportunity to, to step away. And it's rare that we'll keep the game idea unless it's so good that we just need somebody to do it. So what happened last year was that somebody did get their game picked, and they were one of the music students because they had gotten their game picked in the fall and they didn't want to just be a team lead again because they feel like they already did it and someone else should have a turn. So what happened was, once they formed the group, that person handed the mantle of team lead onto one of the other people that was in the team. And so that was fine, right? The narrative story-driven games are mentioned are difficult. Narrative story-driven because it's difficult to be able to create a story in a short period. Like Passage was about as much as you can do, right? But anything where there is like a lot of reading will be hard to do in a short period when people are trying to demo it. It's not saying that it's impossible. It's just difficult, and people aren't necessarily good at making like a good short narrative experience. These things tend to drone a bit. So not impossible, but we would like to see it done right. And so you have to have a really good idea as to how you'd make something like short but powerful, right? Are the game titles locked in? No. There's going to be times when we're going to give you an opportunity to say, yes, this game is great. Let us know what the final title you want to use is, and we will go with that. So, you'll have some time. Could you explain more about, the narrative ones? Okay, so I can only speak to what we've seen in the past. So people who have done narrative story-driven games, what happened was that people would it would start off as a story, and then there'd be some dialogue, and it would be like other person dialogue, and it just kind of came back and forth. And so people felt like they were reading somebody's story, but there wasn't this sense of interaction to be able to say, well, am I actually in charge of this and not? I feel like I'm basically just reading like a digital novel. Like, how do I make something where the story kind of is part of a more interactive experience? And so this is, again, we're not saying that it's impossible. We just said historically, when we've seen this, there's only been one or two where they kind of had something that was interesting. And it wasn't as much a narrative story-driven game. It was more like a walking simulator kind of thing. So you were kind of going through and then things were happening, but you were still in charge of the movement of the character and the character's interaction with the world. But I mean, if you're going to do a narrative story-driven game, it would need to be something where you could imagine people playing it in 5 to 10 minutes, and you would have something really different that hadn't been considered before in past narrative story-driven games. Otherwise, there isn't going to be this feeling of like, wow, or aha. It's like, oh, okay, it's a narrative game. That's fine. So you'd want to think about what is it that you're going to do to allow the player to still interact with this game, where it's highly based on narrative story elements, and there's something about it that's going to make people familiar with this genre feel like they've seen something new. It's hard, but if you can do it, and you can sort of communicate that, then we would be more than happy to allow it. It's just, the only one that's harder than that is fighting games. I would say if you're going to try to create like any like fighting game, like a Street Fighter kind of style, that's going to be incredibly difficult because those are tuned forever to be able to get the experience just right. It seems like it's something that's just natural to do, but it is really, really hard to be able to figure out, like, yeah, how are you going to sculpt this thing so that the players' movements feel good, the way they interact with each other feels good, you know, everything feels natural. It's no one has done that right. No one has ever made a successful fighting game in this course before. Again, I'm not saying it's impossible. Obviously, people make fighting games, and obviously people make narrative story-driven games. And I am currently on a narrative story-driven game kick as I explore a bunch of interesting titles. So I'm not saying that I disapprove of it. We're just trying to make sure that you know what's happened in the past to help inform whatever games you make right now. Even, yeah, game design, like, you can do it. I'm not saying you can't suggest it. I'm just saying no one has ever succeeded. We always allow at least one fighting game in, just in the hopes that this time it'll work, and it's never worked. So, and if you look up things like, you know, like fighting games and how much time it takes to iterate through different versions to come up with the thing that we just kind of play and not think about, it is an incredibly difficult concept to be able, or an incredibly difficult process to be able to master. Florence, a good example. Yeah, I mean, they're all great. There's a lot of great story-driven games. What I'm trying to say is that just like with great fighting games, there's a lot of good ones. It's just incredibly hard for people to do, because a lot of it seems, those games are the ones that seem simple once they've been created, but are actually like really difficult to put together. And if that's what you want to do, and if it seems like a compelling idea, then we'll let you do it. And if it doesn't work, that's fine, because we're not trying to make money off these games. The whole purpose of this course is to have you have the experience of trying to make a game, you know, and seeing what happens to it. And if it fails, it fails, because this is a course. You can afford to fail in a course, and there's no harm. In fact, it's more beneficial to you long term, because any experience later in life where you can't afford to fail, you'll be able to tap into the lessons you pick up here to be able to help you understand what to do or not to do in the future. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying, like, you know, just understand that it is much more challenging than it might initially seem to make a really good fighting game or make a really good narrative story-driven game. That's all. Okay, you know what? That's all I've got for today. I'm going to stop recording. The next time we see each other, I think we're talking a bit about what you actually have to do during your pitch. But the rest of this, make sure that you have a chance to submit some game ideas to us, and we will let you know shortly which ones seem like they'll be the main games for this year's course. Okay. All right, that's it for me. Have a good day, everybody, and we'll see you all soon.